My name is Everett. I'm 41 years old, and for the past 13 years, I was married to a woman named Nadine. To most people, we looked like one of those quiet couples, the kind that holds hands at grocery stores and shares a knowing look across a dinner table. We weren't flashy, not the Instagram perfect type. Just steady, private, and predictable. Maybe that's why no one saw it coming. Maybe that's why I didn't either. The unraveling didn't happen overnight. It was slow, like water seeping into the foundation of a house, silent but devastating. At first, I noticed little things. Nadine started going to bed before me, even though she was always a night owl. Her phone, once left on counters and couches without thought, now lived in her back pocket or under her pillow. She started using headphones for everything, even for simple music. I told myself it was just a phase. People change. Marriage goes through seasons, right? But inside, I knew. It's hard to explain the feeling of emotional absence when someone is still physically there. She was present in the room, but her laughter was shorter. Her eyes no longer lingered on mine. The warmth in her voice faded, replaced by a softness that felt too polite, like she was speaking to a coworker, not her husband. One night, we were sitting on the back porch. It was late September. The leaves had just started turning, and the air had that crisp edge to it that I've always loved. We were sipping tea in silence. That used to be enough for us, comfortable silence. But this time, it felt like we were both waiting for something to snap. And I realized I was holding my breath. She looked out into the dark and said, "Do you ever feel like we became different people?" I turned to her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. We used to talk about everything. No, I don't know. I feel like we don't even see each other anymore. I wanted to tell her that I still saw her. Every day. That I noticed the way her eyes always drifted toward the front window when her phone buzzed. That I knew she had started dressing differently before going out, not better, just different. I wanted to ask who she was really texting at 2 a.m., sitting on the floor in the hallway. I wanted to scream, but I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just said, "Yeah, I guess we did." And then I went to bed while she stayed outside. I heard her crying softly around midnight. I didn't get up. Weeks passed. A part of me was already grieving a loss I hadn't officially faced yet. I started staying later at work, though no one asked me to. I took long drives, turning off my phone. I avoided looking at old photos. And I stopped asking questions because I wasn't ready for the answers. Then, something changed. Nadine became lighter. Her eyes had a new energy behind them, and she started humming in the kitchen again. But it wasn't joy that returned, it was detachment. She had made peace with something, and I could feel myself falling behind in a race I didn't know we were running. She started meeting friends more often. Friends I'd never heard of. Names that never appeared twice. I never accused her. I never raised my voice. I just listened, nodded, and took longer showers to cry where she couldn't hear me. One Sunday morning, she placed a cup of coffee in front of me and sat across the table. She smiled, not the smile I knew from the early years, not the shy, playful one that made me fall for her. No. This one was clean, rehearsed, and distant. That's when I realized this wasn't my wife anymore. She hadn't physically left yet, but she had emotionally packed her bags a long time ago. And me? I just sat there, quiet, still, watching a life I built with my whole heart slowly dissolve into something unrecognizable. This is the beginning of that story. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. But when she crossed the final line, I walked away without a word. The strange thing about the beginning of the end is how ordinary it looks from the outside. That morning, the one with the quiet coffee and the forced smile passed without a single argument. No slammed doors. No shouting. We even folded laundry together that afternoon. The house was silent except for the soft sound of clothes being sorted, sleeves tucked inside each other, her humming gently under her breath, like we were any old couple getting through a Sunday. But every movement felt heavy, as if the air between us had thickened into something I didn't know how to name. I started noticing the way she avoided looking at me directly. It wasn't obvious, no big gestures or dramatic turns. But her gaze hovered near me without ever landing. I'd ask a simple question like, "Do we need groceries?" And she'd answer without lifting her head, "I think we're good." The tone was always polite, never cruel, but it was like speaking to someone in a dream, someone who didn't quite know you were there. I spent that week trying to feel something solid again. I kept going into the garage just to reorganize things that didn't need organizing. Old paint cans, loose nails, extension cords. I'd run my hands over everything like I was hoping to touch something real, something that wouldn't shift beneath me. I even pulled out our wedding box, the one tucked up on the shelf behind the Christmas lights, and opened it like it might contain a map back to whatever we lost. Inside were photos from that beach wedding in Maine, a dried-out corsage, and a handwritten note she'd tucked into my jacket pocket that day. My forever, it read. Just 2 words. But back then, it felt like a promise. I sat there on the cold concrete floor staring at that note until the sun disappeared and the garage light buzzed on overhead. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't want to, but because even my tears felt like they didn't belong anymore. They were a reaction to a version of her that no longer existed. I wasn't grieving a betrayal. I was mourning a ghost. That Friday, she told me she was heading to a dinner party. It was last minute, she said. A friend from her yoga class invited her. She didn't think I'd be interested. She didn't even pretend to offer me a seat at the table. She just kissed me lightly on the cheek, the way a relative might, and grabbed her purse. I watched her check herself in the mirror by the door. She adjusted her earrings, smoothed down her blouse, smiled at her reflection in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't for me. That much was clear. When she left, I sat on the couch in the quiet. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't look at my phone. I just stared at the empty chair across from me, the one she always curled up in when we talked about our days, back when we still had things to say. I tried to remember the last real conversation we'd had. Not about bills or groceries or errands. A real one. About fears or dreams or even a stupid argument over what to watch. But I couldn't. It had all blurred into a soft, dull silence. Like the background noise in a hotel lobby, pleasant, forgettable, empty. Around 10:30, she texted me. I'll be home late. Don't wait up. No punctuation. No heart emoji. No, love you. Just the plainest sentence I've ever read. And I obeyed. I went to bed alone, staring at the ceiling for hours. I didn't ask where she was. I didn't call. I just lay there in the dark, letting the space beside me fill with every unspoken thing we'd both been too scared to say. The next morning, she was already in the kitchen when I woke up. Hair tied up, wearing one of my old t-shirts like nothing had happened. She handed me coffee, smiled, asked if I slept well. I looked at her, searching her face for a sign, guilt, shame, regret, even defiance. But there was nothing. Just that same distant warmth. Controlled. Composed. Familiar and yet impossibly far away. That's when it really hit me. I had been dismissed from my own life, and the replacement hadn't even been dramatic. She didn't scream. She didn't cheat in some movie-style scandal. She just let go, piece by piece, until all that remained between us was formality and the echo of what we used to be. I didn't tell her what I suspected. I didn't ask for proof. I didn't search through her phone or her bag. I didn't become the kind of man who spies or begs or explodes. I just watched her pour coffee into a mug like any other day and knew, with absolute clarity, that the woman I married had already left me long ago. Not in body, but in soul. And me? I still hadn't left. Not yet. But I could feel something shifting deep inside, not anger, not desperation, just an understanding. That there was a final line. A quiet, invisible threshold. And Nadine was already standing on the other side. I just hadn't crossed it yet. But soon, I would. There's something strange about how the smallest details become the loudest in a quiet marriage. You stop reacting to the big things, the long absences, the vanishing warmth, and instead, it's the sound of her laughter coming from another room that hits you like a cold slap. That Sunday afternoon, I was upstairs organizing some old paperwork, taxes, insurance documents, things that used to feel important when the future was still a shared concept, when I heard her laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was genuine. The kind of laugh that spills out unfiltered. And it wasn't meant for me. She was in the living room, phone pressed between her cheek and shoulder, arms free to move as she chopped something in the kitchen. I don't know who she was talking to, but it wasn't a family member. I know her voice when she's talking to her sister. I know how she softens it when speaking to her mom. This one was different, light, flirtatious, and completely absent of the heaviness she carried when she spoke to me. I didn't move. I stood there at the top of the stairs, holding a folder of medical bills in one hand and silence in the other. I felt like a stranger in my own home, someone who had wandered into another man's life by accident. She laughed again, and I swear, I could hear the smile in her voice. That particular sound used to be mine. Now it belonged to someone else. When she noticed me standing there later, she didn't flinch. Just looked up from the cutting board and said, "I thought you were still at the store." I hadn't even left the house that day. She must have mistaken silence for absence. And maybe she was right too. That night, I lay awake long after she drifted off. Her breathing was steady beside me, peaceful. I watched the shadows move across the ceiling and thought about how surreal it felt. This version of marriage. No shouting matches, no infidelity confirmed in black and white evidence. Just a quiet undoing. A wordless divide. 1,000 tiny betrayals wrapped in polite smiles and distant eyes. I began to notice how careful she'd become with her phone. It never left her side. Even when she showered, it was placed on the bathroom counter, screen down. Notifications no longer chimed aloud. She'd muted everything, hidden everything. And still, I didn't confront her. Because by then, I understood that asking her to stop hiding would be like asking a falling leaf to climb back up the tree. The damage had been done long before I ever noticed. I started journaling at night, something I hadn't done since college. Not to write poetry or make sense of things, but just to remember who I was before all this. Before the tension. Before the slow fade. Before the weight of pretending everything was okay crushed the man I used to be. One entry I remember clearly. Today, she wore lipstick to go to the grocery store. She hasn't worn lipstick in months. Not for me. Not for dinners. Not for anything. But today she did. And it wasn't for the produce section. There were no photos. No confessions. Just instincts. Feelings. You don't need proof when your soul is bleeding truth into your bones. One Wednesday evening, I came home early from work. There was no grand plan behind it. I just wanted to see what the house felt like in the middle of the day, when it was usually filled with absence. As I stepped into the front hallway, I heard a soft voice, hers, coming from the back patio. I didn't make a sound. I just stood behind the partially closed blinds, watching. She was sitting on the lounge chair, barefoot, phone cradled between both hands, smiling. It wasn't the smile she used when speaking to neighbors or coworkers. It was the kind she used to give me when we'd lie in bed talking about nothing, drunk on each other's presence. She laughed again, that same laugh from earlier in the week. Light. Unburdened. And then she whispered, "I miss you too." I didn't flinch. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even look away. I just watched, knowing that this moment would mark a shift inside me. Not an explosion. Not rage. But clarity. Later, she came in, humming again, cheeks slightly flushed. "Oh," she said when she saw me in the kitchen, "I didn't hear you come in." She kissed me on the cheek, and I let her. I looked at her, really looked at her, not the woman I married, but the one who now wore a mask so effortlessly I wondered if she even remembered the original face underneath. I wanted to ask her who he was. I wanted to ask when it started. I wanted to ask if she ever planned to tell me. But instead, I asked if she wanted tea. She smiled. Sure. That night, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her sleep. The woman I once believed I'd grow old with now looked like a stranger wrapped in familiarity. I thought about all the effort it must take to lie so gently, so beautifully. I thought about how much of myself I had given to someone who no longer saw me. And still, I didn't argue. Still, I didn't beg. I just watched and listened and understood that there was a moment coming, not of confrontation, not of fury, but of stillness. A moment when she would cross the final, quiet line. And when she did, I would not raise my voice. I would not ask for her to stay. I would simply walk away. The strange part is, even when everything around you feels off, your body still tries to pretend you're okay. I woke up the following Monday morning with the sun slipping through the blinds, golden light spilling across the sheets like it had a right to be beautiful, even when nothing else was. Nadine was already gone. Her side of the bed was cold, the sheets folded back neatly, no trace of her except for the faint scent of her lavender lotion. It used to be a comfort. That morning, it felt like a reminder of absence. A clean exit. She'd left a note by the coffee maker, Jim. Then brunch with Mindy. Love you. I stared at the words for a long time. They were written with her usual casual script, looping letters that used to fill my birthday cards and sticky notes on the fridge. But now, they looked like a stranger had borrowed her handwriting. I drank my coffee slowly, alone in the silence of the kitchen, where the ticking clock was the only thing that dared to speak. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed things I hadn't really seen in months. The framed pictures on the walls that hadn't been updated in years. The scuffed leg on the dining table I always meant to fix. The small crack in the kitchen tile that looked like a road map I couldn't follow. I realized our house wasn't just quiet, it had stopped growing. It had stopped becoming. Later that afternoon, I drove without a destination. I passed the park where Nadine and I used to sit on lazy Sundays, sharing sandwiches and watching kids fly kites. We hadn't been there in almost 2 years. I didn't even remember the last time she packed a lunch for us, just because. It used to be something small she did when she felt close to me, thoughtful things that didn't need a reason. Those gestures disappeared slowly, one by one, like leaves falling out of season. I ended up near the edge of town, by a quiet lake that rarely had more than a few people around. I used to fish there with my father as a kid, long before I met Nadine, long before I thought love was supposed to last. I sat by the water for what felt like hours, not thinking, just existing, watching the ripples push gently against the shore. It was the first time in weeks, maybe months, that I felt stillness without sadness. I started asking myself questions I hadn't dared to voice. Was I staying because I loved her? Or because I loved who she used to be? Was I trying to save our marriage? Or was I clinging to a version of myself that only existed when I was with her? Who was I, outside of this crumbling house and this slow goodbye? The wind picked up, brushing the trees softly. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. It was small, barely noticeable, but real. I no longer felt desperate for her to come back. I no longer believed I could fix what had already turned to dust between us. The sadness didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became quiet acceptance. When I got home that evening, Nadine was already there, curled up on the couch with a throw blanket and a glass of wine. She looked up and smiled. "You were out late," she said, not accusing, just noting. I nodded. "Went for a drive." She didn't ask where. She didn't press. We sat in silence for a bit, the kind of silence that used to be companionable but now felt more like two people waiting for a train on separate tracks. Eventually, she said, "I was thinking we should take a trip. Just the two of us. Maybe Maine again." The suggestion hung in the air like a fragile thread, and I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt like an echo from a different lifetime. Maine was where we fell in love, the lighthouse, the quiet beaches, the small cafes where she'd steal sugar packets just to make me laugh. I wanted to tell her it was too late for that. That you can't go back to a place and expect it to repair what time and distance have quietly shattered. But instead, I said, "Sure. Let me know the dates." She smiled, satisfied, and turned her attention back to the television. I watched her from the corner of my eye, wondering if she truly believed that a weekend away would somehow glue us back together, or if she was just playing her role until she could step off stage completely. It didn't matter. I had already stopped waiting for an apology, or an explanation, or even honesty. Later that night, while she showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The name that popped up was just initials. K. But it was enough. She came out of the bathroom humming, towel wrapped around her head, completely unbothered by the version of herself she thought I couldn't see. And me? I pulled the covers up, turned away, and closed my eyes. Not to sleep, but to disconnect. I realized then that her betrayal wasn't what had broken me. It was the ease with which she wore the mask, the comfort in pretending, the graceful way she abandoned me without ever walking out the door. That's what cut the deepest. She hadn't left the marriage. She had evaporated from it. And the moment I truly accepted that, something inside me began to rebuild. Not to win her back. Not to fight for something already lost. But to prepare for the walk I knew was coming. The walk away. Without a word. There's a kind of sadness that doesn't come with tears. It doesn't scream. It doesn't beg to be seen. It just sits quietly beside you, day after day, like a shadow that no longer cares about the sun. I had grown used to that shadow. It followed me through every room of the house, through each routine that used to mean something. Morning coffee, brushing my teeth beside her, setting the alarm at night. And I realized I wasn't living with Nadine anymore. I was living beside her. One Thursday evening, just after dinner, she sat across from me, scrolling on her phone while half listening to something on the TV. Her fingers moved fast, her face lit by the glow of the screen, a small, pleased smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't trying to hide it anymore. Not really. She had moved into a new emotional space, one where the version of me who used to matter was no longer part of her inner world. And somehow, I had given her permission to forget me. We barely spoke during meals now. Just polite check-ins. How was work? Fine. You? Busy. And that was it. There was no follow-up, no curiosity, no reaching across the emotional gap. She existed in her world. I existed in mine. We had become a well-rehearsed performance. And the only audience left was silence. It wasn't always like this. I remembered our first few years together. Sunday mornings spent wrapped up in each other, long walks just to talk, lying on the floor at midnight laughing over nothing. We used to share books, trade music, argue about silly things like who made the better cup of coffee. That version of us had vanished. And the tragedy wasn't in the disappearance. It was in how gently and thoroughly it happened, without either of us noticing until it was far too late. One night, I found her asleep on the couch, phone still in her hand. I gently took it and placed it on the table beside her, careful not to wake her. But as I turned away, I saw the screen light up. Another message from Kay. I didn't open it. I didn't read the full preview. I didn't need to. The way her fingers curled protectively toward it, even in sleep, told me more than words ever could. I stood there for a long time, watching her. She looked peaceful, innocent even. But all I could feel was the ache of being invisible in a life I helped build. It wasn't betrayal in the traditional sense. She hadn't confessed to anything. But she didn't have to. The emotional vacancy was its own kind of infidelity. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in months. I took the day off work. I didn't tell her. I packed a bag, not to run, but to breathe. I drove to a small cabin a couple hours outside the city. A place we'd gone once years ago during a particularly hard winter when we needed to reconnect. This time, I went alone. And as I sat by the fireplace that night, sipping tea and staring at the flames, I realized how long it had been since I'd been still, truly still, without waiting for the next emotional blow to land. I let myself feel everything. The grief, the guilt, the bitterness, the resignation. But underneath it all, something else had begun to form. Not hope. Not yet, but clarity. I had spent the last year shrinking myself to fit into a marriage that no longer had room for me. I had given her all the space she needed to drift, believing that love meant staying silent while someone quietly walked away from you. But love, real love, is a two-way effort. And whatever this was between us now, it wasn't love. It was habit, performance, a routine built on the fear of starting over. And I was done pretending it was enough. I stayed at the cabin for 2 nights. No texts, no calls, no explanations. When I returned, she didn't ask where I'd been. She barely looked up from her laptop. "You're back," she said, as if I'd just stepped out for groceries. I nodded. Yeah. And that was it. That weekend, we were invited to a neighbor's barbecue. We went, playing our parts, smiling when needed, laughing at the right cues, telling the same old stories we'd rehearsed over the years. But I noticed something. When someone asked Nadine how we were doing, she hesitated. Just for a second, then smiled and said, "We're good." But her eyes flicked away quickly, and in that moment, I saw it. The effort it took to maintain the illusion. On the walk home, I didn't hold her hand. I kept my distance. The night air was warm, but my chest felt hollow. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and chose not to care. Back inside the house, she went upstairs without a word. I sat in the dark living room for a long time, surrounded by furniture we picked together, in a house we once dreamed about late into the night. And all I could think was, I've been mourning a woman who isn't dead. I've been trying to bring someone back who doesn't want to be found. And in that realization, I found a strange kind of peace. I didn't need her to confess. I didn't need her to choose me. All I needed was to stop choosing someone who had already left. The art of letting her pretend, that chapter was over. The next one would begin in silence and end with footsteps walking out the door. It happened on a Tuesday. A day like any other. No storms, no headlines, no dramatic music swelling in the background. Just the hum of the air conditioner, the soft clicking of a keyboard in the other room, and the quiet realization that everything had finally settled into something that no longer required pretending. It's strange how you think there will be some defining moment when everything breaks apart, shouting, crying, some kind of storm, but for me, it was as gentle as a whisper. That morning, Nadine made French toast. I hadn't asked for it, hadn't even mentioned I was craving anything. But there it was, perfectly golden on my plate, drizzled with syrup, the way I used to like it. She placed it in front of me without a word, sat down across the table, and stared at her phone while sipping her coffee. For a moment, I wondered if it was an apology. If, in some small way, this was her reaching out, trying to find the version of us that still knew how to connect. But then her phone buzzed again, and she smiled. That private, intimate smile I hadn't seen in years. And it wasn't meant for me. I took a bite. It tasted like nothing. We moved through the morning like actors on autopilot. She went into her home office. I sat on the back porch with a notebook in my lap, watching the trees sway in the wind. And I thought about how long it had been since I looked at the sky without feeling like I was waiting for something. A call. A confession. A reason to leave. A reason to stay. Instead, there was nothing. Just peace. And I didn't know whether to welcome it or fear it. Around midday, I heard her laugh, that soft, melodic kind of laugh that once belonged to me. I didn't get up. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. Because by now, it didn't matter. What hurt wasn't that she was sharing pieces of herself with someone else. It was that she hadn't noticed I stopped asking. That I'd already started leaving, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, piece by piece. That evening, she suggested we watch a movie. I said yes. Not because I wanted to, but because it felt like the easiest answer. We sat on the couch, a full cushion of space between us, watching something I don't remember. Her hand never reached for mine. My eyes never drifted toward her. We were two bodies in a room full of history, sharing silence and screen light. About halfway through, she paused the movie to take a call. She stepped outside, her voice low and careful. I didn't try to listen. I didn't have to. It was the way she moved, light, soft, smiling at the dark, that told me everything. I could hear pieces of her laugh drift back in through the window, as if the wind itself was teasing me with the last threads of what used to be ours. When she came back inside, she didn't say who it was. She didn't offer any explanation. She just sat down beside me, pressed play, and leaned slightly toward me, not enough to close the gap, but enough to keep the illusion alive. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in. I just let the moment pass, like so many others. Later that night, I stood in the hallway, lights off, watching the soft glow spill from under the bathroom door as she got ready for bed. I could hear her humming again. That same song she used to hum when she was falling in love with me. And I stood there, motionless, letting that sound wash over me like a wave from a distant life. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what it felt like when we were still real. When her touch meant something. When her eyes didn't look past me. But memory is cruel. It shows you the highlight reel while reality crumbles quietly at your feet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about what it would mean to finally leave, not in anger, not in pain, but in quiet truth. To step away from the ruins of something I once treasured, and to do it without demanding closure, without needing her to understand. I thought about where I'd go, what I'd take, who I'd tell. I pictured myself carrying a single bag down the front steps, locking the door behind me, and walking into a world that didn't know my story. And then I asked myself the hardest question. Would she even stop me? The silence that followed was my answer. The next morning, I woke early. She was still asleep, curled on her side, breathing softly. I stared at her back, at the woman I once thought I'd die beside. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit. She had made peace with losing me a long time ago. She had moved on while staying in place. And now it was my turn. But I didn't wake her. I didn't write a letter. I didn't make a speech or deliver a verdict. Instead, I quietly got dressed, walked downstairs, poured myself one last cup of coffee in that kitchen full of echoes, and stepped out onto the porch to feel the morning air. And as the sun broke across the horizon, spilling golden light over everything we'd built together, I realized the world hadn't ended. It had simply changed. And I was ready to walk into it, alone, not broken, not bitter, just free. I didn't leave that morning. Not yet. I wanted to. I had made peace with it. But something inside me told me to wait one more day. Not because I expected anything to change, and not because I had hope left to lose. I think I just needed to know that when I finally walked out that door, it wouldn't be in anger, or confusion, or desperation. I wanted to be empty of all the reasons I used to stay, and I wanted to carry nothing of her with me into whatever life was waiting on the other side. That day passed slowly, like time itself was stretching to test my resolve. Nadine was unusually quiet, even by recent standards. We crossed paths in the kitchen once or twice. She mentioned needing to run errands. I nodded, and that was the extent of our interaction. The absence of tension felt eerie. It wasn't calm, it was more like standing in the eye of a storm you already survived. All the destruction had already taken place. Now it was just about walking through the rubble and knowing you'd never rebuild on the same ground again. I spent the afternoon in the study, cleaning. Not because it was dirty, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I went through old books, dusted off photo albums, opened drawers that hadn't been touched in years. In one, I found an old pair of reading glasses she used to wear before she got contacts. I turned them over in my hands, remembering the first time I saw her with them, how she laughed and said they made her look like a librarian, and how I told her she'd never looked smarter or more beautiful. Back then, everything between us was light, playful, full of wonder. Now I couldn't even remember the last time I made her laugh. I found our honeymoon scrapbook tucked away behind a stack of forgotten papers. Pages filled with pictures from the coast, windblown hair, sunburned smiles, the way she used to look at me like I was the only thing in the world that made sense. I sat there staring at those images, not with regret, but with a strange sense of awe. Not because I missed it, but because it once felt so real. Like a dream I woke from so slowly, I didn't even realize I was asleep. When she got home later, her energy was off, fidgety, distracted. She said something about her car making a strange noise, then trailed off halfway through the sentence. I watched her, waiting for a crack to show, for a moment of realness to break through. But it never came. Instead, she went upstairs, and I heard the shower turn on, water rushing like static between us. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the carpet. All I could think about was how easy it had become for her to keep secrets in plain sight. How natural it was for her to disappear without ever leaving. She didn't lie with words anymore. She lied with gestures, with silences, with empty smiles that once held meaning. And then, finally, it happened. Later that night, she sat beside me, laptop open, pretending to scroll through vacation spots. "Still thinking about that trip?" she asked, not looking at me. I answered with a quiet sure, knowing full well I'd never see that trip. And that's when she said it, so casual, so offhand. I almost didn't catch the weight of it. "I might go ahead and visit my cousin in Denver next weekend. Just for a few days. You wouldn't mind, right?" There was no cousin in Denver. And she didn't look at me when she said it. That's how I knew she wasn't asking. She was informing me. She had already booked the flight. Maybe not on paper, maybe not with a credit card yet. But the flight in her heart had taken off months ago. And now she was just waiting for me to stop pretending it hadn't. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, at the way she avoided my eyes, at the way her fingers tapped anxiously against her wine glass. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood. That was it. That was the line. The final one. She'd crossed it gently, silently, without cruelty or theatrics. Just another small step in a long walk away from me. I stood up, and she looked over, surprised. "You okay?" I didn't answer. I just nodded, walked into the hallway, and stood there for a moment, surrounded by the quiet. And in that quiet, I could hear everything, every word we hadn't said, every truth we hadn't faced, every little moment of dishonesty that had chipped away at the life we built together. It was all there, like echoes in an empty house. And then, I felt it, peace. Real peace. Not the kind that comes from resolution, but the kind that comes from release. The kind that says, "You gave everything. You stayed too long. And now, it's time." I walked back into the living room. She was already flipping through channels, half listening, eyes unfocused. I sat beside her, quiet, still, and I said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The next morning felt like any other, and yet I knew it wasn't. The light coming through the windows was the same soft gold it always was. The familiar scent of coffee lingered in the air, and Nadine moved around the kitchen like a woman in control of her world. She didn't know, not yet, that this was the end, that I had made my decision, not in a burst of anger or heartbreak, but in the quiet space between the lies and the long silences. She placed a mug in front of me without a word, then went back to checking her phone. I stared at the steam rising from the surface, watching the pattern swirl, disappear, reform, like something trying to hold its shape but slowly giving into the air. I took a sip. It was warm, familiar, a routine gesture that no longer meant anything. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need it to. There was no fight, no grand moment of confrontation, no ultimatums. I didn't mention the fake cousin in Denver. I didn't ask who Kay was. I didn't list out all the things that had gone wrong. I didn't want her to admit anything, and I didn't need closure from her anymore. I had already found it, quietly, over time, in the slow grieving of a love that faded like old paint under sun. Around noon, I packed a bag. Just one. A few clothes, my laptop, a couple books, and a photo from our early years, not because I wanted to hold on to her, but because I wanted to remember that love once lived in me that deeply, that I had been that open, that giving, that hopeful. It was a reminder of who I was and of the capacity I still carried. She didn't notice me walking up and down the stairs. Or maybe she did and chose not to ask. That had become her pattern, pretending not to see what made her uncomfortable. She had grown so used to silence, it no longer registered as a warning. Just before I left, I stood in the doorway of the living room. She was curled up on the couch with her laptop open, watching something, earbuds in. I looked at her, The woman who once said I was the safest place she'd ever known. The woman who had slowly walked herself out of my heart without realizing the door would eventually close. She looked up briefly. You heading out? I nodded. Yeah. Where to? Just need a few days, I said gently. To clear my head. That's all. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not sadness, not regret, just a glimmer of awareness that something was shifting. But she didn't ask more. She didn't follow. She just nodded, said, okay, and went back to her screen. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. I stepped outside, the weight of that house slipping off my shoulders like an old coat I'd worn too long. The sun was bright but not harsh. The air carried that soft early autumn coolness, the kind that whispers change is coming, and it's okay. I didn't look back. I didn't hesitate. I drove for a while without music, just letting the road stretch out in front of me. I passed neighborhoods and towns and trees I didn't recognize, and that felt right. Because I was no longer carrying her story, only mine. Eventually, I stopped at a small coastal town we once visited years ago. I checked into a quiet inn, walked to the shore, and sat on a weathered bench facing the ocean. The waves moved slowly, endlessly, washing the world clean with every pass. I took a deep breath. Not because I needed to calm myself, but because I finally could. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel broken. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to choose me. I had chosen myself, without rage, without revenge, without bitterness. In the days that followed, I found rhythm in the quiet. I read in cafes. I wrote in journals. I walked without checking the time. I smiled at strangers. I slept with the windows open, letting the breeze carry away pieces of the past I no longer needed. And one morning, sitting at a small wooden table with coffee and a fresh croissant, I laughed. Out loud. Not at anything in particular, just at the feeling of being alive again. Nadine didn't reach out. I didn't expect her to. I don't know if she ever realized that I wasn't coming back. Maybe one day she will. Maybe not. That part doesn't matter anymore. Because this isn't a story about loss. It's a story about waking up. About walking away not to escape, but to begin. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. When she crossed the final line, I didn't say a word. I just walked away and found the version of myself I thought I had lost. And I was still there. Quiet. Whole. Ready. And finally, free.